I want to ask you to think about something as we think about this matter of quarantine. What is the worst quarantine there could be? I want you to make up your mind in relationship to that. We'll talk about it in the latter part of this lesson. But just think about all the different kinds of quarantines there are. There is the quarantine of solitary confinement. A guy's in prison and they lock him up, and as a matter of punishment, they'll put him in a prison somewhere, and he's not allowed, at least in times past, never allowed at all. And sometimes quarantine means you're allowed perhaps out 30 minutes or an hour per day. Solitary confinement, they call that. I found it rather interesting that the longest solitary confinement in a federal prison in America was in one in Colorado. It began in 1983 and it ended in 2019. That's a long time to spend all by yourself without interface with anyone else. In the state penitentiary, the longest person was in the state of Louisiana. It had to do with some racial problems that dated back to 1972, when America was really, really struggling in relationship to this. And there was a lot of perhaps racism in the sentences and everything, but there were three individuals. They were called the Angola Three, were in solitary confinement from 1972 until 2016. Is that 40 years? Is that 44 years, if I'm not mistaken, if I've done the math right? Can you imagine? You're 20 years of age whenever you're put in there, and I'm not sure the age of all three of the men that were in there, but you're 20 years of age, and now you're 64 years of age, and every day you've been locked up in solitary confinement. There's a magazine I've not heard of. It's called Mother Jones magazine, that says that there is in America an individual who right now has been in solitary confinement for 40 years. No details about where that was. That's one kind of quarantine. Anything any worse than that? What about the matter of being shipwrecked on a desert island? We think about that. Some movies popularize that. Some novels in the past popularized that, and that is being shipwrecked on a desert island or lost at sea. I tried to find the longest time an individual was lost at sea and never found an island until they finally landed on one. 76 days. That's a long time. Just by himself in a lifeboat that was some less than 10 feet long, perhaps more like 6 feet long. And for 76 days, he was out in the ocean all by himself. That's a long time to be alone. I know it doesn't exactly fit the idea of a quarantine, but it's sort of like one, isn't it? Imagine spending all of that time. Then the matter of amnesia. I think about this whenever I think about Don Blackwell, who will perhaps be on our lectureship this year, a gospel preacher, and he said recently, I saw him in a discussion on the computer. He said, I went out riding on that ATV and I woke up, and the next thing I remember, other than was just sort of riding on the ATV, I was in an intensive care room and had no idea where I was. Now, that's not amnesia, but have we not heard of individuals who had that kind of experience? Something traumatic happened, and all of a sudden they woke up and they did not know who they were or where they were or anything like this. Some of you will know the name Inell Ingram. Inell had surgery many years ago. She had a growth a tumor of some kind on the side of her head, and fortunately it had not penetrated inside the skull, but the doctor said to her, if it's inside the skull, when you wake up, you may not have any memory of who you are. That's an amazing kind of thing to all of a sudden you wake up and the world has so changed. It's Rip Van Winkle, but you don't know your name is Rip. And all of a sudden you're living in a world and there's nothing around you that is familiar. That's sort of like we have been somewhat. What about the matter of being isolated in an intensive care situation? There are those in this church who've been admitted to the hospital, those who've carried their loved ones to the hospital, and they drop them at the emergency room door, and they'll say, well, we'll call you and tell you how everything is. And the person goes inside, and they're locked inside that intensive care room. There'll be people that come in and out, but they're all strangers. Is there anything any worse than that? Well, somebody says, Dan, I've had it up to here. I'll tell you, this coronavirus is the worst thing that could ever happen. I just cannot imagine anything other than what we've had to put up with in the last few days. Well, it's nothing compared to some of these other things that we've discussed, but can we not sympathize at least and have some understanding of what it's like to be isolated and quarantined and locked up? And I put the next point here in this sermon, not because it specifically fits, but to help us understand the importance of fellowship with other people and the impact that it has whenever church discipline is brought on an individual and there is the withdrawal of fellowship. That individual has been an active member of the church in their lives, and all of a sudden they no longer are part of having that fellowship, that time together. It's like those of us, the few of us who are here tonight. It's just all the difference in the world in singing with a handful of people and singing with this auditorium full. All the difference in the world, and walking into the building where everybody is here and it's wonderful, and there is that great interchange of being together, and then the withdrawal of that. That individual who has been withdrawn from finds themselves isolated from fellowship. Let's talk about a biblical example, and that is the Apostle Paul. I want you to think about Paul and all that he endured in his life and many of the things that were involved in his life. But when you get to the book of 2 Timothy, Paul has lived his life to its fullest. In chapter 4, verse 6 through 8, he says, I've finished everything that I've intended to do. I've run the race. I've finished the race. I've fought the battle. I've been victorious. And the time of my departure is at hand. It is interesting that Paul writes this perhaps after a second imprisonment. Evidently, when he goes to Rome at the end of the book of Acts, there is a first imprisonment where Paul is there and he has all sorts of freedom. He has a house. He has those individuals, those Roman soldiers who are there watching over him, but he has unbelievable freedom and people can come and go, and that's the kind of thing that was happening. Paul evidently was released because in some of the later epistles, Paul talks about being at places that you do not read about him being at in the book of Acts. And so evidently he was released. At my first answer, he describes something happened. And so he talked about what transpired at that first time. And now he's in Rome a second time. The very fact that he says, at my first defense, no one stood with me. I want you to think about the isolation that Paul has. I want you to have an appreciation of all that he has endured in his life, and now he arrives at Rome, but troubles come. We know a lot about the persecution of Christians by Nero. When Paul says, I appeal to Caesar, his answer was given to Julius Caesar. Well, not Julius, but to Nero Caesar. I want you to think about that. Mad Nero, who wanted someone to blame for the burning of Rome, and he blamed it on Christians. I remember a 7th grade history book that I had from many years ago, and a photo I will never forget looking at it. It was not a color by one by any means. It was one where they'd take a wood block and carve something on the block and then hit it with the ink pad and then stamp that thing inside that book. And there were these Christians who were tied to poles and to crosses, to at least to wood structures of some kind, and fire was burning underneath them, and was at some of the parties that Nero was given. And so Paul's first defense comes up evidently about this very same time. Now, because he's a Roman citizen, evidently he is released, but there are no Christians that are there. You read those last 2 chapters of the book of Acts, and Paul, after he leaves the island of Malta and he goes up all the way through Italy before he ever gets to Rome, and he talks about, we landed at this place and the saints were there. We landed at this place and the saints were there. And we landed at this place and the saints were there. And now Paul says, when the trial came, I stood there by myself. Now, this is his second imprisonment. But at that first time, he says, everyone forsook me. May it not be laid against their as a charge against them. And then he says, but the Lord stood with me. There's a lot to be said about that statement. And the affirmation is, we are never alone. I want to say a word to some of you who have been quarantined, as it were, perhaps living in the house by yourself. Someone, I believe, was our former missionaries out in the South Pacific, but they're now in Italy, and they were finally allowed in Italy to go out. They went down to the park, and they said, posted just recently on Facebook, we had a conversation with a person, and it's the first person we've had a conversation with since early in March. That's a long time. But it may be that you're almost in that same situation. It may be people call you on the phone, and let's hope that that continues to happen. But I want you to understand that you are never, ever alone. Sometimes when a loved one dies, we think, well, I wish I could have been there. They died all by themselves. That's not true of the faithful Christians. And that's what Paul says. What happened at that first imprisonment was tragically terrible. But now he says, the Lord stood with me that the message might be preached, that all the Gentiles might hear. I was delivered from the mouth of the lion, and the Lord will deliver me. You know what he says earlier in this chapter? Right now he says, I'm in prison and no one is with me except Luke. I want you to think about that. Those pictures of the place where Paul is alleged to have been in prison shows a very, very small room. No ability to walk any distance at all. Some of those guys that we mentioned before, that Angola, 3 individuals down in Louisiana, the cell they were in was 10 feet long and 5 feet wide. Imagine being in that kind of a confinement. And now Paul, from prison, says, Demas has forsaken me. And he said there were other people here, Crescent, and there were others, and they've gone in various places, and I'm here all by myself. Luke is with me. Imagine Paul in that situation. In fact, in chapter 1 of this book, Paul says, Timothy, you know that all those in Asia have turned against me. Paul had preached 3 years in Asia. And there's not a brother in Asia that would stand with Paul. He's all by himself. How tragic that is. Could there be anything other than that kind of quarantine? Could there be anything worse than that? And the answer is yes. And that is to be quarantined from the presence of God. What's the worst quarantine there could be? I want you and I to be reminded tonight of what is described in Matthew chapter 25. Starting in verse 41 until the end of that chapter, here are the words of quarantine. When Jesus says to those on his left hand, "Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." Sometimes we talk about, will we know each other in heaven? You know what hell is like? It's outer darkness. In hell, you will not even be able to see anyone. What would you hear? Imagine that kind of confinement. Imagine that kind of being quarantined. We talk about the situation in which we find ourselves and we think it's bad, but can you imagine being in outer darkness? Inner darkness, there might be some glimmer of light, but outer darkness, there's no glimmer of light at all. What do you hear? I want you to hear this description. Wailing and gnashing of teeth. What kind of groaning is that wailing that is described there as being in that place? A friend of mine years ago in Birmingham, in his workplace, stood on a rooftop. The building that was adjoining his building caught on fire. He saw the individuals. The firemen got on that rooftop trying to knock a hole in that roof so they could squirt water on the fire. And he said, Dan, I stood there and I watched that roof as it collapsed. And I saw those men sliding into that pit of fire with their hand doing everything they could to grab onto any part of that roof. And he said, I saw them fall into the fire. Can you imagine the wailing that is involved in that? When I read that expression, I think of a friend of mine in Birmingham who had had surgery. They'd opened up his lower abdomen and done some surgery that was there. He had no family, he had no one at the hospital. I was there with him when he came out of the operating room, and back in those days, you did not put him in intensive care. They just took you back to a regular room. And he was lying there in bed, and I was waiting for him to wake up. And in his grogginess, he reached over and grabbed that rail that was on the side of the bell opposite of him, and he turned himself in that direction. And as he did, he started ripping the stitches that were down the front of his body. I shall carry to my grave a remembrance of the screaming that he did in that one moment. And when I think about hell, outer darkness, wailing, screaming, and the gritting of teeth because of the intensity of the pain. That's not some imaginary place. It's a place the Lord has prepared for the devil and his angels. And he said, and you choose to live like the devil, and that's exactly where you're going to go. Let me mention 4 truths about this final quarantine. That is, that judgment day in Matthew 25 is the final one. There is no second chance. There are times perhaps in your life in which you missed a test at school and you were able to take the test over again. There might have been times whenever you got a second chance, whenever somebody intervened, but I want you to know hell's judgment is final. And that quarantine is the final judgment. There is no escape, and it is eternal. You know why I preach? Look at these 2 points that are on the board and understand the motivation of preaching the gospel, and that is everybody that I preach to is going to stand before God. Matthew 25, before him will be gathered all the nations, and he'll separate them. All the dead will be raised. And all of those to whom I've ever preached, and all of those who are hearing me right this very minute, you'll be there. And I want you to know that that judgment is final. And I want you to know that it is eternal, everlasting punishment. The book of Revelation chapter 14 says, and the smoke of their torments ascended up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night. That's the worst quarantine there could ever be. But I want to caution you and tell you that if your attitude is, someday I may be lost. Someday I'm going to be lost. And we think about that as though we don't have to sort of make that decision, that there is someday when we will be lost. But I want you to know, if you're going to be lost someday, you are lost right now. That's the danger of letting this world get in between us and our relationship to God. But on the positive side, if you are separated from God right now, it is not God's choice. You've made decisions that are wrong. Briefly, let me give you several reasons to avoid that quarantine and live every day right now on this earth in the presence of Jesus. I want you to know, if you are a faithful Christian, you have these things here and now that the world does not have. You have a peace that passes all understanding. The Bible talks about that peace that passes all understanding will referee in your life, will guard your life, will guard you. And it makes no difference about what's happening in your life if you're never alone, because the Lord is with you you have a peace that passes understanding. You and I need to understand that we have freedom and liberty. Unlike those individuals who are in that prison, they have no freedom. God has given us a freedom from sin and a freedom from guilt that the world itself will not understand the matter of the peace that we have, nor understand the forgiveness and the liberty that we have in relationship to this. I want you to understand that right now you have the greatest friend on this earth. Jesus said, greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. If you're a child of God, just because there's some adversity in your life and you feel like you're quarantined in some way, I want you to understand that you have a friend in Jesus. And that song, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, is not some idle song that we sing. There's not a friend like Jesus. No, not one. How do I know this? Because he laid down his life for me. I want you to know that if you are a faithful Christian, regardless of how quarantined you may feel at this time, you have the empowering faith and the hope that it brings. Think about the promises of God that sustain us and help us, and because we believe, because we have faith in the promises of God, every one of those statements of faith become nothing more than a statement of fact. We know, not we wish, not wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in a place like this? We know that all things work together for good. And the very situation in which you find yourself right this very minute, and you feel lonely and there's anxiety perhaps in your life because of the uncertainty of the things that are there, faith will empower you and give you an anchor on which to build your life. Let me tell you what you have. The world does not have the answer to these three questions. Paganism does not have it. Education does not have the answer to this question, where did I come from? What happens to me when I die? And why am I on this earth right now? Do you understand how readily, as a child of God, you understand that? You know where you came from. In the beginning, God, and that answers it all. What happens when you die? If you don't have Christ in your life, look at all the answers that paganism gives of coming back as some animal or reincarnation of some kind. And the fear there is of death that you and I do not have, though we walk through the valley of the shadows of death. We know what happens when you die. And I want you to know that right now you understand why you are on this earth. The world doesn't have that. And in the midst of the adversity where they are quarantined like we are, they have none of these things that are on the screen at this moment. You and I need to understand there is absolute assurance of the guidance that we receive about the decisions that we make. The guidance is perfect. I don't know what I ought to do about this. The Bible says, if you lack wisdom, ask of God. and use the avenue by which God can give us wisdom. And when we arrive at that guidance from God, it's impossible for it to be a decision that will wreck our lives. And I want you to know there's power to control and change all that you hate about yourself. Sometimes when we're isolated, we start looking at ourselves and we get a sense of worthlessness. And we think, I just wish I could be as good as so-and-so. I wish I could do that. In Romans chapter 7, Paul talks about his life and about that part of his life whenever he wanted to do good, but everything that he wanted to do good, he was a failure at. He wanted to keep himself away from that which was wrong and to hate that which was evil. And the things that he hated the most was the very thing he found himself. He's talking about himself under Judaism, without Christ. And when you get to the end of that section, he says, "O wretched man that I am, I long to do good and I'm not doing it, and I hate things in my life, and that's the very thing I find in my life." And you right now in your loneliness may have looked at yourself and said, why did I do that? That mistake that I made. Oh, wretched man that I am, wipe that out of your memory. For Paul says, there is now no condemnation to those that are in Christ, and I thank God that I have deliverance through Jesus Christ. Read that closing paragraph of Romans chapter 7 and the early verses of Romans chapter 8, and you'll have an understanding of the fact that you can change and control all of that is in your life because there is forgiveness, and the empowerment of faith will allow you to overcome all of these things. And finally, things that we've mentioned before, and that is the power to change the world, to change what happens on this earth. Hear the words of God. Hear the words of God spoken to you about you in your isolated situation. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. You and I need to understand that the word man there is not just talking about masculine. The effectual, fervent prayer of one who is righteous avails much. And if you live with the Lord, and He has declared that you are righteous, then if you fervently pray, it avails much. Don't you dare give up. You be determined that when all of this is over and we reassemble here together and we are able to spend this time together and enjoy that fellowship that we once had, don't you dare give up. Because you and I understand that the Lord will put the wicked in quarantine, but He'll never put us in quarantine, because the Lord stands with us. Remember that. When there's loneliness and you think, I don't know how much more of this I can put up, I'm in this house all by myself. Oh, no, you're not. The Lord stood with me when nobody else on this earth stood with me. Avoid that worst quarantine and enjoy the blessings that we've just been talking about in relationship to this. The plan of salvation we know, and we remind you of the fact that if you're not a child of God, there's a way to avoid that eternal quarantine, and there's a way which right now you can have the greatest life on earth. God help us to live faithfully until the day that we die, because Jesus said, you be faithful unto death and I'll give you the crown of life. How can this church help you to live faithfully to Him? You let us know how we can help. and we'll do all that we can to help you with the spiritual problems that confront you. Thank you very much, and thank God for the fact that He's always with us.